Liverpool, in the years after the Second World War, was a city defined by resilience and reinvention. The docks, once alive with ships carrying goods and stories from every corner of the globe, had grown quieter amid economic hardship. The scars of the Blitz bombed-out buildings, rationed food, and a lingering sense of uncertainty remained vivid memories for many. Yet, within this battered city, as one writer would later call it, something extraordinary was stirring among its youth. It was in these streets, terraced houses, and modest council estates that John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr began their journeys, shaped by family, hardship, and the rhythms of distant lands. Each of the four Beatles came from backgrounds marked by both love and loss. John Lennon spent his early years with his Aunt Mamie and Uncle George after his parents' unstable marriage led to him living apart from his mother, Julia. Though he saw Julia occasionally, it was Mimi's firm hand and George's occasional kindness that provided the structure, if not always the affection of home. In this environment, John developed both a sharp wit and a rebellious streak, traits that would later define his musical persona. Paul McCartney's childhood, though more stable, was not without his shadows. His father, Jim, was a constant presence, encouraging Paul's early musical experiments and filling the house at 24th and Road with the sounds of jazz and popular tunes. After his mother's early death, Paul and his brother Michael found solace in music, and Jim's encouragement played a pivotal role in nurturing Paul's talents. The McCartney home would eventually earn the nickname the birthplace of the Beatles, as it became a gathering place for rehearsals and songwriting sessions in the band's early days. George Harrison, the youngest of the group, grew up in a working-class household that eventually moved to a council house, a modest, government-provided home. This move proved significant, as the Harrison home became a rehearsal spot for local musicians. George's early life was marked by shyness and a passion for the guitar, fueled by the records and radio broadcasts that drifted into Liverpool from across the Atlantic. It was here, in the quiet of his family's home, that George began to develop the skills that would later make him an essential part of the Beatles' sound. Ringo Starr, born Richard Starkey, faced perhaps the most daunting challenges of the four. Raised primarily by his mother in a modest home, Ringo's early years were marred by illness and long hospital stays. His father left when he was young, leaving his mother to provide for the family as best she could. Despite these hardships, Ringo developed a close bond with his mother, whose unwavering support and resilience left a lasting impression. From this foundation, Ringo would develop not only his sense of humor, but also the steady, unshakable beat that would later anchor the Beatles. Liverpool itself was a character in the Beatles story, its post-war identity looming large over their formative years. The city had been battered by war and was only beginning to recover. Food rationing persisted, unemployment was high, and prospects for young people were often limited. Yet Liverpool's status as a port city meant it was a place where the world's cultures brushed shoulders, if only briefly. Merchant seamen, known locally as Cunard Yanks, brought back not just news and stories, but also records. Precious, crackling slabs of American music that would become the soundtrack to a generation's awakening. This infusion of American rhythm and blues, country, and rock and roll found fertile ground in the hearts of Liverpool's youth. Teenagers, hungry for escape and excitement, began to form their own bands, inspired by the likes of Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. The rise of skiffle, a do-it-yourself musical style based on American folk and blues, offered a way in. Skiffle was accessible. Its simple instrumentation meant that even those with little money could join in, and for working-class Liverpudlians, this democratization of music-making was revolutionary. In this environment, John Lennon found his first real musical outlet. At Quarry Bank High School, he formed a band called the Quarrymen, named after the school. Their repertoire was a mix of skiffle standards and early rock and roll, reflecting the influences swirling through the city. The local music scene was competitive, with countless bands vying for attention in clubs, church halls, and even living rooms. Each group tried to outdo the next, and the hunger for American sounds gave the Liverpool scene a distinct edge. It was at a church fete in July 1957, in the garden of St. Peter's Church in Wilton, that John Lennon and Paul McCartney's paths first crossed. The Quarrymen were performing, and Paul, already a gifted musician, was introduced to John backstage. The story of their first meeting has become the stuff of legend, but the facts remain simple and striking. Paul played a few songs for John, displaying an easy command of the guitar and a knack for remembering lyrics. John, impressed by Paul's musicality and confidence, invited him to join the group. This was the beginning of a partnership that would shape not just their lives, but the course of popular music. Paul's arrival brought new energy to the Quarrymen, and soon after, he suggested bringing in his school friend, George Harrison. George, younger than the others but already a skilled guitarist, was initially met with some skepticism by John, who questioned his age. However, George's technical ability soon won John over, and he was welcomed into the fold. With George's addition, the group's sound grew more sophisticated, and their ambitions stretched beyond the skiffle roots that had first inspired them. The early days of the band were marked by constant change. The lineup shifted, names were tried and discarded, and influences evolved. American rock and roll continued to be a guiding light, with the Quarrymen and later the Beatles absorbing the styles of artists like Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. Their openness to American music and, unusually for the time, its racial influences set them apart in a Britain that was still largely insular in its tastes. This willingness to look outward, to blend and adapt, would become a hallmark of the Beatles' approach. Rehearsals took place wherever space could be found, often in the front rooms of their childhood homes. The McCartney home at 20 Forthland Road, in particular, became a hub of creative activity. Here, with the encouragement of Paul's father, the group experimented with harmonies, arrangements, and their own embryonic songwriting. The Harrison family's council house also became a gathering spot, a place where the boys could play without fear of disturbing the neighbors too much. These ordinary homes, filled with the clutter and laughter of family life, became laboratories for the new sound that was taking shape. Liverpool's landmarks, Penny Lane, the Cavern Club, the city's bustling streets were woven into the fabric of the Beatles' early music and identity. The Cavern Club, a cramped and sweaty venue in the city center, became the focal point of their live performances. It was here that the Beatles began to build a local following, honing their stagecraft and their sound in front of an audience that was both supportive and demanding. Penny Lane, immortalized later in song, was a real place for the band, a symbol of their roots and the everyday beauty of their surroundings. The challenges faced by each Beatle in their youth loss, illness, shyness, and poverty were not unique in post-war Liverpool, but the way they responded set them apart. Music became a means of expression and escape, a way to transcend the limitations of their circumstances. The rise of skiffle music, with its spirit of improvisation and inclusivity, gave working-class youth like John, Paul, George, and Ringo an entry point into a world that had previously seemed closed to them. By 1960, the band had crystallized in both purpose and personnel. The Quarrymen had evolved, shedding and gaining members, and experimenting with a series of names before settling, finally, on the Beatles. Stuart Sutcliffe, a friend of John's from art school, joined on bass for a time, contributing to the group's visual style and early sense of camaraderie. At this stage, Pete Best was the drummer, and it was only after the Hamburg period that Ringo Starr, whose reputation as a solid and inventive drummer was growing in Liverpool's music circles, joined in 1962, completing the lineup that would become legendary. The Beatles' early performances were marked by a raw energy and a sense of fun that belied the difficulties of their upbringing. Their local identity, as boys from Liverpool, was not something to be hidden but celebrated. In a time when most bands tried to obscure their origins, the Beatles made Liverpool part of their appeal, infusing their music and personalities with the humor, warmth, and resilience of their city. The cultural and musical environment of late 1950s, Liverpool was crucial in shaping the Beatles' developing sound. The city's openness to outside influences, particularly from America, gave the Beatles a head start in absorbing and reinterpreting the latest trends. Their willingness to experiment, to blend genres, and to embrace the new while honoring the old set them apart from their contemporaries. The competitive local music scene pushed them to improve, and the support of family and friends provided the foundation for their growth. As the Beatles took their first tentative steps onto the stage, whether in church halls, local clubs, or the cramped front rooms of their homes, they were already forging a unique identity. Their experiences of loss and love, hardship and hope, were distilled into the music they made together. Liverpool, with all its challenges and charms, was not just the backdrop to their story, but its beating heart. In these beginnings, the foundations of a legend were quietly being laid. The friendships, rivalries, and collaborations that took root in the shadow of post-war Liverpool would soon blossom into something the world had never seen. The Beatles, shaped by their city and their circumstances, were poised to take their first steps beyond Liverpool and to change the world of music forever. Under the neon glow of Hamburg's red light district, the Beatles began their transformation. In August 1960, they stepped off a train into a city rebuilding itself with a speed and swagger Liverpool could only dream of. Hamburg was rough, vibrant, and hungry for live music. The Beatles were still young, barely out of their teens, and the lineup included John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, bassist Stuart Sutcliffe, and their newly minted drummer Pete Best. They were little more than a local Liverpool act, but the city's bustling club scene would become their crucible. Their first engagement was at the Indra Club, a smoky dive that demanded hours of music each night, 7 nights a week. The conditions were grueling. They slept in cramped, windowless rooms behind the stage, barely earning enough for food. Hamburg was a city on the make, but for the Beatles, it was also a trial by fire. They played marathon sets, often stretching past midnight, learning to hold the attention of rowdy, sometimes indifferent crowds. The audience wanted American rock and roll, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis Presley. The Beatles obliged, drawing from their vast repertoire of covers, but in the process, they began to develop their own sound and stagecraft. The hardship was real. The band clashed with club owners, and there were brushes with the law. George Harrison, underage and far from home, was deported for working illegally. Paul and Pete spent a night in jail after being accused of arson when they tried to retrieve their possessions from a club after being fired. These setbacks might have broken a lesser group, but the Beatles emerged tougher and more focused. They learned to play as a unit, reading each other's cues almost telepathically, and perfected harmonies that would later become their signature. Hamburg was also where the Beatles adopted their soon-to-be iconic look. Inspired by local art students, they swapped their greased-back teddy boy hair for the XI mop top, a style that signaled they were not just another British rock and roll band. Stuart Sutcliffe, the band's original bassist and John's close friend, was especially influential in this shift, though he would soon decide to stay in Hamburg for love and art, leaving the group and his instrument behind. By the time the Beatles returned to Liverpool, they were a different act, slicker, louder, and more confident. Word of their performances in Hamburg had spread, and their homecoming shows at the Cavern Club drew bigger and more enthusiastic crowds. It was here, in the sweat-soaked underground of the Cavern, that they first caught the attention of Brian Epstein. Epstein, the well-dressed manager of a local record store, was struck by the energy of their performances and the devotion of their fans. He saw something in the Beatles, a spark that set them apart from the scores of other bands crowding Liverpool's clubs. Brian Epstein's approach was both ambitious and methodical. His background was in retail and family business, but he quickly adapted to the world of music management. Epstein believed fervently in the Beatles' potential. He tidied up their image suits instead of leather jackets, synchronized bows at the end of songs, a more disciplined approach to their gigs. It was not just about looking the part. Epstein understood that the Beatles needed to be taken seriously by the music industry, and he set about making them professional in every sense. He also set his sights on a recording contract, a prize that had so far eluded the group. The major British labels were skeptical. Liverpool was far from London, and guitar bands were still considered a fad by many executives. Epstein was undeterred. He made the rounds, tape in hand, lobbying each company in turn. Most turned him down, but his persistence eventually paid off in the form of an audition at EMI's Parlophone label. George Martin, the head of Parlophone, was intrigued enough to give the Beatles a chance. The audition at EMI's Abbey Road studios in June 1962 was pivotal. Martin was impressed by their energy and humor, if not their technical polish. He recognized that their harmonies and personalities were something special. Still, he was not convinced by Pete Best's drumming and suggested a change. Soon after, Ringo Starr, already known in Liverpool for his steady beat and idiosyncratic style, joined the band, replacing Pete Best as drummer after the Hamburg period and finalizing the lineup that would soon become world famous. On May 31, 1962, the Beatles signed their first contract with EMI. The agreement was not particularly generous by modern standards, but it was the foot in the door they desperately needed. George Martin became their producer, and his role quickly expanded beyond that of a typical studio overseer. He challenged the group to refine their vocals and arrangements, offering musical suggestions that would become central to their sound. It was Martin who encouraged them to experiment, and his input on harmonies, instrumentation, and recording techniques would shape the Beatles' evolution from a live act to studio innovators. The first single, Love Me Do, was released in October 1962. Its modest chart success hinted at greater things to come, but it was the follow-up, Please, Please Me, that marked the real breakthrough. With its infectious melody and propulsive rhythm, the song shot up the charts, signaling that the Beatles were more than just another pop group. Their debut album, recorded in a single marathon session, captured the raw energy of their live act and established them as a force in British popular music. As their popularity grew, something extraordinary began to happen. Crowds at their shows became larger and more frenzied. Fans, mostly young women, screamed, fainted, and chased the band from venue to venue. Newspapers coined the term Beatlemania to describe the phenomenon. It was a level of fandom Britain had never seen. Early television appearances only fueled the frenzy, as millions tuned in to see the Beatles' mop-topped exuberance and witty repartee. By 1964, the tide had turned from national to international sensation. The Beatles' first visit to the United States was a watershed moment. When they stepped off the plane at New York's JFK Airport, they were greeted by thousands of ecstatic fans and a wall of reporters. Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show was watched by an audience estimated at over 70 million people, a figure unprecedented in television history to that point. Within weeks, the Beatles held the top 5 positions on the American Singles Chart, an achievement unmatched before or since. This explosion was not just about catchy songs or stylish haircuts. The Beatles' appeal lay in their unique blend of musical influences: American rock and roll, rhythm and blues, Motown, even hints of country and folk all filtered through the sensibilities of 4 young men from northern England. Their sound was fresh, energetic, and emotional. Their lyrics spoke to the hopes and anxieties of a generation coming of age in the early 1960s. George Martin's role as producer was crucial in the group's ascent. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Martin saw recording as an art form, not just a technical process. He encouraged the Beatles to push boundaries in the studio, exploring new sounds and arrangements. Even in these early years, the partnership between the band and their producer yielded innovations, double-tracked vocals, unusual harmonies, and creative use of the studio that would soon become hallmarks of their work. Brian Epstein, meanwhile, guided the group through the perils of sudden fame. His management was not without controversy. Some criticized his inexperience, but his belief in the Beatles never wavered. He secured them a recording contract with EMI, ensuring their creative and financial future. Epstein's efforts to professionalize the band and protect them from exploitation were instrumental in allowing them to focus on music and performance. The Beatles' rapid rise changed not just popular music, but the entire landscape of youth culture. Beatlemania swept across continents, inspiring a wave of British acts to try their luck in America and touching off what became known as the British Invasion. The Beatles were at the forefront, their success opening doors for others and shifting the center of gravity in popular music from the United States to the United Kingdom. In Britain and abroad, the Beatles became symbols of a new era, one defined by optimism, rebellion, and the belief that anything was possible. Their concerts were marked by an intensity that bordered on chaos, with fans sometimes drowning out the music with their screams. Yet, behind the scenes, the group continued to evolve. Their early albums drew on the energy of their live shows, but with each new single and long play, they began to experiment with songwriting and studio techniques. By the time 1964 drew to a close, the Beatles had moved far beyond the club circuit of Liverpool and Hamburg. They were global stars, their faces and music instantly recognizable on every continent. It was a journey marked by talent, hard work, vision, and a fair share of luck. The crucible of Hamburg, the discipline of Brian Epstein, and the creative partnership with George Martin had all played essential roles in their rise. Looking back, it is clear that the Beatles' ascent was not inevitable. Every step from the grimy clubs of Hamburg to the polished studios of Abbey Road required risk, resilience, and a willingness to embrace the new. They turned adversity into advantage, transformed setbacks into opportunities, and, above all, remained true to their instincts as musicians and friends. The world was ready for the Beatles, but perhaps more importantly, the Beatles were ready for the world. Their rise to stardom was not just a story of 4 young men from Liverpool, but a testament to the power of music to capture imaginations and change lives. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles were no longer just a pop group. They had become a cultural force, redefining what popular music could be and leaving a lasting mark on nearly every aspect of modern life. Their journey from Liverpool teenagers to global icons was driven by a restless urge to experiment, to push boundaries, and to question not just what a song could sound like, but what it could mean. As the 60s progressed, the Beatles' creative evolution became a powerful engine for innovation and influence, fueling transformations in music, fashion, and even the very shape of youth identity. The shift was clear in their records. While earlier pop acts focused on singles, brief, catchy hits made for radio, the Beatles began to pioneer the album as a unified artistic statement. Projects like Rubber Soul, Revolver, and especially Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band elevated the long play from a collection of tracks into an immersive experience. This was not just about longer songs or new instruments, though those played a part. It was about treating the studio itself as an instrument, using it to create sonic landscapes that could not be replicated on stage. With producer George Martin, the Beatles layered tape loops, backwards recordings, orchestral swells, and exotic instruments into their music. These innovations did not just expand the band's own creative palette, they changed the very language of popular music. Their willingness to break with convention, whether in song structure, lyrical themes, or recording techniques, offered new models for what popular music could aspire to. Songs stretched beyond the 3-minute mark, prompting radio stations to adapt and make room for longer, more complex tracks. The Beatles' approach to singles and albums encouraged other musicians to view their work as art, not just entertainment. This shift, subtle at first, became a tidal wave, sweeping through the music industry and influencing everything from how records were produced to the way artists negotiated with labels. But the Beatles' impact extended far beyond the studio. Their music became the soundtrack for a generation grappling with rapid social change. Young people in Britain and around the world looked to the Beatles as symbols of liberation, experimentation, and new possibilities. Everything about them, from their haircuts to their public statements, seemed to challenge the established order. Their embrace of Indian music and spirituality, for example, opened doors for Western audiences to new sounds and philosophies, fueling interest in meditation, yoga, and Eastern religion. The Beatles' fashion choices, colorful military jackets, round glasses, and psychedelic prints, set trends that rippled through youth culture and beyond. It was not just about style. The Beatles' music carried ideas, sometimes playful, sometimes subversive, that resonated with listeners hungry for change. They wrote about love and loneliness, but also about alienation, identity, and the search for meaning. The sheer variety of their output, from the Baroque pop of Eleanor Rigby to the avant-garde collage of Revolution 9, suggested that pop music could encompass anything if only you dared to try. Even their approach to album covers, think of the montage of faces on Sgt. Pepper's, became a canvas for self-expression and social commentary. This spirit of innovation did not just inspire fans, it sparked a revolution among fellow musicians. The Beatles' willingness to experiment with genres and recording techniques set a new benchmark for creativity. Their influence can be traced in the work of later titans like the Beach Boys, who responded to Rubber Soul with Pet Sounds, itself a landmark of studio artistry. Led Zeppelin, Nirvana, Oasis, and the Police all drew on the Beatles' legacy, whether in their songwriting, their ambition in the studio, or their drive to craft original voices. Bands later labeled Beatlesque, such as Radiohead, followed the Fab Four's lead in constantly evolving their sound and taking creative risks. Even contemporary artists from genres as diverse as hip-hop and electronic music have sampled Beatles tracks or cited them as a touchstone for their own innovation. The Beatles' impact reached into the very structure of the music industry. They played a pivotal role in changing how artists related to record companies, pushing for more control over their work, from songwriting to production choices. Their insistence on artistic autonomy helped pave the way for future musicians to demand similar freedoms. The shape of the music business itself, from the prominence of the album format to the role of the producer, shifted in their wake. Of course, the story of the Beatles is also one of pressures and fractures. The unprecedented intensity of Beatlemania, constant media scrutiny, and the relentless pace of recording and touring all took their toll. The death of manager Brian Epstein, who had been the group's stabilizing force, left a void that was never truly filled. Without Epstein's guidance, disagreements over business decisions and creative direction began to fester. Leadership shifted uneasily among the band members, and outside influences, most notably the presence of Yoko Ono in John Lennon's life, further complicated the group's internal dynamics. While the public sometimes singled out individuals to blame for the breakup, the reality was much more complex, involving creative differences, financial disputes, and the simple fact that the Beatles had outgrown the structures that had once bound them together. By 1970, the band that had changed the world was no more. The announcement of the breakup, though shocking to fans, seemed almost inevitable to those close to the group. Each member had begun to chafe against the confines of the Beatles, eager to explore new musical directions and personal identities. The dissolution of the band was not so much a sudden rupture as the culmination of years of strain, negotiation, and competing ambitions. In the aftermath, the world mourned not just the end of a band, but the closing of an era. Yet the story did not end there. In the years that followed, each of the former Beatles embarked on solo careers marked by both triumphs and setbacks. George Harrison, sometimes overlooked during the Beatles' heyday, emerged as a formidable songwriter and artist in his own right. His album, All Things Must Pass, and its hit single, My Sweet Lord, showcased a spiritual and musical depth that drew wide acclaim. Some commentators have argued that George's solo work, particularly in the early 1970s, surpassed that of his former bandmates in both ambition and execution. Paul McCartney, meanwhile, formed Wings and enjoyed massive commercial success with songs like Band on the Run. John Lennon's solo output, including the poignant Imagine, further cemented his reputation as a voice for peace and introspection. Ringo Starr, often underestimated, found his own niche with hits such as Photograph and collaborations with a wide array of musicians. The solo careers of the ex-Beatles were inevitably measured against the towering legacy of the band, but they also deserve recognition on their own terms. Each member explored new stylistic ground, sometimes returning to their roots, sometimes venturing into uncharted territory. Their individual achievements added new facets to the Beatles' collective legend, demonstrating that the creative spark that fueled the band was not confined to a single era or partnership. Notable songs from their solo years, whether George's What Is Life, Paul's Maybe I'm Amazed, John's Instant Karma, or Ringo's It Don't Come Easy, became classics in their own right, further enriching the tapestry of modern music. For all the heartache and drama of the breakup, the Beatles remained a touchstone for artists and fans alike. The group's recordings continued to sell in astonishing numbers, and their songs became fixtures in the canon of 20th century pop. Decades after their final studio sessions, the Beatles' catalog remained vital, rediscovered by new listeners and sampled by contemporary musicians. Their influence radiated outward. Modern artists such as Paul Weller, Noel Gallagher, Kasabian, and Gary Barlow have cited the Beatles, and especially the innovations of Sgt. Pepper's, as formative to their own music. Even in genres far removed from 1960s rock, the Beatles' fingerprints can be found. Hip-hop artists, for example, have sampled their records or drawn inspiration from their adventurous spirit. The term Beatlesque has become a kind of shorthand for a particular blend of melodic inventiveness, sonic experimentation, and restless creativity. Bands aspiring to that mantle are often judged not by their ability to mimic the Beatles' sound, but by their willingness to take risks and reinvent themselves. In this sense, the Beatles' true legacy lies less in any single song or style than in a kind of artistic permission, a sense that music, and by extension all art, can be a vehicle for transformation and discovery. It is difficult to overstate the Beatles' impact on the broader sweep of popular culture. They helped shape British identity at a time when the country was emerging from post-war austerity and asserting itself on the world stage. Their songs became anthems for social change. Their images graced posters and album sleeves, and their words echoed in the debates and dreams of a generation. Even as musical fashions have shifted and new technologies have changed the way we listen, the Beatles' work has endured, adaptable, influential, and perennially fresh. The band's story, of course, did not end with the dissolution of their partnership. Efforts to come together for special projects, such as the anthology series, demonstrated both the enduring fascination with their legacy and the complicated bonds that united them. Public perception of the breakup, and the myths that have grown up around it, remain the subject of debate and reflection. What is clear, however, is that the Beatles' music has lost none of its power to move, provoke, and inspire. In the end, the Beatles' legend rests not just on what they achieved, but on the possibilities they opened up for others. They proved that popular music could be art, that albums could tell stories, and that four young men from Liverpool could change the world, not by following the rules, but by rewriting them. Their songs continue to be sung, sampled, and celebrated, their influence echoed in the work of countless musicians who have followed in their footsteps. As long as there are artists willing to take chances, as long as listeners seek meaning and beauty in music, the Beatles' spirit will endure, a testament to the enduring power of innovation, influence, and the courage to imagine something new.